Today, we will look at the history of Vietnam. We are making these videos because there are so many people who do not know much about Vietnam and its history, okay? And yet Vietnam is such an important country in our world today. It is home to over 100 million people. It is one of the fastest growing economies in the world. It's also a key player in the geopolitical rivalry between China and the United States. But for most of modern history, Vietnam was seen as the other one. The first time that most Westerners learned about Vietnam was when they saw newsreels of the Vietnam War on the evening news. So let's start with the Vietnam War. We can't understand Vietnam without understanding the Vietnam War. The war had a profound impact on the Vietnamese people. It killed hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese civilians and soldiers. It divided the nation into North Vietnam and South Vietnam. And it made Vietnam into an international hotspot. After the war, Vietnam was reunified again. But this only happened after the fall of Saigon in 1975. Before the 1970s, the two parts of Vietnam were officially called the Democratic Republic of Vietnam in the north and the Republic of Vietnam in the south. Each side claimed to be the true representative of Vietnam, and each side was backed by a superpower. The north was backed by the Soviet Union and China. The south was backed by the United States, Australia, the Philippines, Thailand, South Korea, and Taiwan. So this wasn't just a civil war. This was a proxy war between the communist world and the free world. When the United States entered the war became very unpopular in America. There were huge protests against the war. And despite being backed by a superpower, South Vietnam was unable to win the war. After the fall of Saigon, all of Vietnam was under communist rule again. The Vietnam War started in the early 1950s and was fought between the US and South Vietnam on the one hand, and North Vietnam and the Viet Cong on the other hand. The Americans did not win the war. Despite having a much stronger military, they were defeated by the Vietnamese. In fact, the Vietnamese turned the tables on the Americans. After the fall of Saigon, American officials realized that they had seriously misjudged the Vietnamese. They found out that the Vietnamese had an extraordinary fighting spirit, but they also discovered something else, that the Vietnamese people had no desire for democracy or capitalism. The Vietnamese people wanted to be left alone. They wanted to build their own socialist style of economy, and they didn't want any foreign influence. And this is what the Americans failed to understand. The Vietnamese weren't fighting for democracy or freedom. The Vietnamese were fighting for their independence from foreign powers. And this is why the Americans couldn't win the war. And it's really important to understand this, because the Americans tried to win hearts and minds through things like development projects. For example, in 1966, the US government created the Vietnam Rural Development Project. This project built schools, irrigation systems, and roads across South Vietnam. At first, the Vietnamese appreciated these projects, but as the years passed, they began to resent them. Why? Because the projects were designed by outsiders trying to bring democracy and capitalism to Vietnam. In other words, the Vietnamese were seen as too primitive to govern themselves. This offended the Vietnamese people. Another example was the introduction of the Vietnamese alphabet. The Latin alphabet was introduced to Vietnam by French missionaries in the 16th century. For centuries, it remained the preserve of the elites. But in 1925, a Vietnamese revolutionary called Phan Chu Trinh wrote a letter to the French colonial government, asking them to make primary education compulsory and to teach children in their native language. He thought that this would help the Vietnamese people get rid of Chinese influence and become more westernized. But this backfired. Teaching children in Latin didn't work because most Vietnamese couldn't speak Latin. It just created a new elite class of educated Vietnamese who still couldn't relate to the majority of the population. Okay, now that we've covered the Vietnam War, let's have a look at some of the highlights of Vietnamese history. As usual, Vietnamese history goes back thousands of years. One of the earliest states in Vietnam was the Kingdom of Van Lang, which was founded in the 3rd century BC. Little is known about this kingdom, except that it was located around the Red River Delta. Later, Vietnam came under the control of China. It was ruled by the Han Dynasty from 111 BC to 403 AD, and then by the Sui and Tem dynasties. But during these centuries, the people of Vietnam never accepted the Chinese rulers. They always felt more connected to their neighbors in Cambodia and Thailand. These neighbors were also influenced by India, and and so were the Vietnamese. Hinduism was popular in Vietnam, and it blended with local beliefs to form a unique religion known as Mother Goddess worship. This was a polytheistic religion based on animism. It's hard to say if Mother Goddess worship was a religion or a cultural tradition. It was certainly not a state religion, since Vietnam never had a state religion. In the 9th century, Vietnam broke away from Chinese rule and became independent again. Now it was known as the Kingdom of Dai Viet. This lasted until the 11th century, when it was conquered by another Chinese dynasty. Once again, Vietnam was ruled by China for the next 1,000 years. The Chinese presence can still be felt in Vietnam today. Around 25% of Vietnam's population speak Chinese as a second language. Many Vietnamese words are similar to Chinese. Many Vietnamese customs and traditions are similar to Chinese customs and traditions. In 1428, Vietnam once again won its independence. This time it was called the Kingdom of Hanoi. Under the new dynasty, Vietnam experienced a golden age. The Vietnamese were highly influenced by Confucianism. In fact, when European missionaries arrived in Vietnam, they criticized the Vietnamese for not becoming Christians and for following Confucius. But this was a mistake on behalf of the missionaries. Vietnam could have easily become a Christian state in the 16th century. Instead, it became one of the most successful Buddhist countries in the world. Vietnam even spread Buddhism to other countries. Vietnamese monks played an important role in spreading Buddhism to Thailand, Cambodia, Laos, and even Japan. In the 19th century, Vietnam fell under the control of the Chinese again. But then the Chinese lost the Vietnam region to the British, and so the Vietnamese were suddenly living under a new colonial ruler. As we explained in the introduction, the Vietnamese were excellent at resisting foreign influence. This time they couldn't do anything about it. The French were way too powerful. The French East India Company colonized Vietnam in the late 1600s. In 1731, they were given a noble title by the Chinese emperor, the King of Cochin-China. But in reality, the company had full control over Vietnam, exploited the Vietnamese people, and drained the country's wealth. By the mid-1800s, the Vietnamese were extremely discontented. They rose up against the French in a massive rebellion, but it was crushed. After the rebellion, the French brought in a new law, which allowed them to take Vietnamese children to France and convert them to Christianity and westernize them. They hoped that these children would return to Vietnam and help turn the Vietnamese people into Western-style Democrats. However, the plan backfired because instead of helping the French, the Vietnamese children hated the French. When they returned to Vietnam, they set up underground organizations to fight the French. Finally, in 1945, Vietnam was free of the French. Now it was time to deal with the Americans. That brings us to the Vietnam War. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button and subscribe. You can also check out our other content. We have a podcast, and we have another channel where we publish different types of videos. Thanks for watching.